Hello, hello. Good evening. Got a few ears out there lurking. You could be interacting in the chat, but you don't have to. It's up to you. Welcome to this Thursday evening's exploration live stream, and I am not only streaming through to YouTube, but I'm streaming through to Kick as well. I've put the link in the chat. Hello, Kick people that are sitting watching as well. Feel free to interact in the chat. I'm not having any censorship or anything on my channel. The only must is mutual respect. But anyway, yeah. Welcome on this very hot in London at the very least Thursday evening, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. Anyway, without further ado, I shall announce that tonight's topic is salt. What do we really know? Yes, that's right, salt. SALT. The first time we explored this topic, which was the last time that we explored this topic, we went through a video called The Salt Lie, What's Really Behind Your High Blood Pressure? It's Not What You Think by Emma Voicey, right? There's lots of people, including scientists, healthcare professionals, all the rest of it, that are pro salt, and there's a lot that are against salt. So I don't know which one's misinformation, and that's why I've got to this topic. We also looked at the Britannica breakdown of salt, which I found quite basic, I must say. But yeah, that was that. That's okay. What we're going to do is go to the next level. I've found, I did a research and I found loads of articles, scientific articles, where it goes a little bit more in depth. There's a couple of them that are for salt, and there's one that's for salt, and a couple that are against salt. And out of the two that are against salt, one of them is from 2016, and the other one is 2020. And I'm thinking maybe we should look at the one from 2020, and then we could look at the one that is for salt. I think I've got dates on that right. Let me just check. Got one here. A systematic review of the sources of dietary salt around the world. May 2020. Then I've got a one from the Journal of Clinical Hypertension. The Science of Salt, a regularly updated systematic review of the implementation of salt reduction interventions, June to October 2015, but published 14th March 2016. And I also have something written in the Oxford Academic, Food Science and Technology section of it, and it's called Assault on Salt Intake, sorry. This is Food Science and Technology, Volume 37, Issue 1, March 2023. So I think I want to look at that one second. The one I want to look at first, I want to go to not the one on sources. Well, actually, yes. Let's have a look at a systematic review of the sources of dietary salt around the world. But before we do that, let's have one little tune, not as long as the last one.
She's laughing with a whiteboard clear, unpacking the fresh pack of pens, never willing to accept of fear. She's loved in channels. Every gate chant on nights and black blue lights. Heaven help them when she recites. Mysterious life, girl got skills. She moves in space with minimum waste and maximum joy. Makeshift desk and a cat that bites. When you see her coming, take your pills. No place for snowflakes or sensitive hearts. When sentiment is left to chance, she'll send you back to your start. We all know it, she's a smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Toast to toast, sometimes switches to crumpet, bends them to jail. Across social media, buy memberships for bail. Verse by verse, exploring the text. She reads and recites, not knowing the tongue, learning every step of the way. Melts all your memories and feeds you facts. Her zeal is like fire, but her heart is of gold. We all know it, she's a smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator. Toast to toast, sometimes switch to crumpet, bends them to jail. Across social media, buy memberships for bail. Smooth moderator. 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 Ooh, moderator. Smooth moderator. Smooth moderator.
And we're back. Just like that. Magic. Okay, so this article, which one did I say I was going to go to? It's a systematic review of the sources of dietary salt around the world, May 2020. That's what we're going to go to. So, I'm not on screen. How do I do that? That's how. Okay. I've got to get this off screen. Right, so that's as big as I can make it for you guys. Yes, and of course, in the description under the live stream, I will eventually get the source, any source that I look at during the live stream, put in there. This says, and now this is in the sciencedirect.com website. And it looks a lot like PubMed and all the rest of them that are on that standard, if you like. A systematic review of the sources of dietary salt around the world. Sayuj Bhatt, Matty Marklund, Megan E. Henry, Lawrence J. Apple, Kevin D. Croft, Bruce Neal, Jason H. Y. Wu. What's this? School of Medicine, the University of Western Australia, Perth, Western Australia, the George Institute for Global Health, Newtown, New South Wales, Australia, the Friedman School of Nutrition and Policy, Tufts University, Boston, MA, which I don't know what MA is. Is that Massachusetts or something? USA, Department of Epidemiology. I don't know where Boston is. Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, Baltimore, MD, USA, Welch Center for Prevention, Epidemiology and Clinical Research, Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, MD, USA, and School of Public Health, Imperial College London, London, United Kingdom. So I wonder if that's to do with where those people are from, um, where they've been studying this. Anyway, the abstract says excess salt intake contributes to hypertension and increased cardiovascular disease risk. Efforts to implement effective salt reduction strategies require accurate data on the sources of salt consumption. We therefore performed a systematic review to identify the sources of dietary salt around the world. We systematically searched peer-reviewed and grey literature databases for studies that quantified discretionary salt added during cooking or at the table, and non-discretionary sources of salt, and those that provided information about the food groups contributing to dietary salt intake. Exploratory linear regression analysis was also conducted to assess whether the proportion of discretionary salt intake is related to the gross domestic product (GDP) per capita of a country. We identified 80 studies conducted in 34 countries between 1975 and 2018. The majority, I don't know what this means, I'm not quite getting these little math terms. N equals 44, or 55%. The majority collected data on dietary salt sources within the past 10 years and were deemed to have a low or moderate risk of bias. So that's 94%. 32, which is 40% of studies, were judged to be nationally representative. Populations in Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, and Romania receive more than half of their daily salt intake from discretionary sources. A significant inverse correlation between discretionary salt intake and a country's per capita GDP was observed. P is less than 0.0001, such that for every $10,000 increase in per capita GDP, the amount of salt obtained from discretionary sources was lower by 8.7%. 95% CI is 5.1% or 12%. Bread products, cereals and grains, meat products, and dairy products were the major contributors to dietary salt intake in most populations. There is marked variation in discretionary salt use around the world that is highly correlated with the level of economic development. Our findings have important implications for the type of salt reduction strategy likely to be effective in a country. Introduction. Hypertension-related cardiovascular disease is a leading cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide. A diet high in salt is one of the leading risk factors for high blood pressure. A Cochrane review of salt reduction studies with a duration of more than 4 weeks found that a reduction of 4.4 grams in daily salt intake led to a decrease in blood pressure of 5.4 slash 2.8 millimeters Hg, which I don't know what that means, in hypertensive individuals, and 2.4 slash 1.0 Hg in normotensive individuals. A more recent Cochrane review observed a reduction in blood pressure of 5.02. Right, I need to find out what these mean because I just don't know what I'm saying. So let's have a look. Blood pressure, I don't know what that means, these symbols, so I'm going to find them. There's a few terms there. There's normal intensive, normal tensive. Sorry, I need to find out what that means as well. Right. Let's blood pressure calculator because this might describe what those terms actually mean. Right. A blood pressure test is a simple way of checking if your blood pressure is too high or too low. Blood pressure is the term used to describe the strength with which your blood pushes on the sides of your arteries as it's pumped around your body. Okay, so this is hypertension, pre high stage 1 and high stage 2. There's normal and there's low. Right. High blood pressure, which is hypertension, can put a strain on your arteries and organs, which can increase your risk of developing serious problems such as heart attacks and strokes. Low blood pressure, which is hypotension, isn't usually as serious, although it can cause dizziness and fainting in some people. A blood pressure test is the only way to find out if your blood pressure is too high or too low, because most people won't have any obvious symptoms. Having a test is easy and can save your life. Okay, where does it show me anything about what those symbols mean? Right, understanding your blood pressure reading. Blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. So that's what the is millimeters, and mercury is Hg. Okay, and it's given us two further figures. Systolic pressure, the pressure when your heart pushes blood out. Diastolic pressure, the pressure when your heart rests between beats. For example, if your blood pressure is 140 over 90 or 140 slash 90 millimeters of mercury, it means you have a systolic pressure of 140 millimeters of mercury and a diastolic pressure of 90 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so going back to, all right, hang on. As a general guide, we'll read this bit. Normal blood pressure is considered to be between 90 over 60 and 120 over 80. High blood pressure is considered to be 140 over 90 or higher. Of course, that's higher than the high end of normal. And low blood pressure is considered to be 90 over 60 or lower, of course, lower than the low end of normal blood pressure. A blood pressure reading between 120 over 80. Hi, Mark Dunk in the chat. Good to see you. And 140 over 90 could mean you're at risk of developing high blood pressure if you don't take steps to keep your blood pressure under control. Right. So, not want to go too far into the ins and outs of blood pressure because we need to go back to that paper, but I just needed to find out what those symbols meant. So, it's millimeters of mercury. mmHg. So let us go back to here we were, and I'm going to start this again then. Oh no, hang on a minute. I want to know what this normal tensive means as well. find that. Normotensive, having normal blood pressure, not hypertensive or hypotensive. So hyper is high, hypo is low. Let me have a look. Nor refers to having, describes individuals. So yes, search assist. The AI says being hypertensive is high blood pressure, hypotensive is low blood pressure. So normotensive is normal blood pressure. All right, so I've got that sorted. And now come out of there, from there, and come back to this time. I don't know if I can teach you anything like Magdang. I've got to try and learn it myself as well. Okay, so back to this science paper. Introduction. Hypertension related cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide. They've got a source further down in the document for anyone to look at. A diet high in salt is one of the leading risk factors for high blood pressure. A Cochrane review of salt reduction studies with a duration of more than 4 weeks found that a reduction of 4.4 grams in daily salt intake led to a decrease in blood pressure of 5.4 over 2.8 milligrams of mercury in hypertensive individuals and 2.4 over 1.0 milligrams of mercury in normotensive individuals. Hi, I'm Dunk. You've found me in Kick as well. Welcome. Remember to follow or whatever that thing is that you're doing there. A more recent Cochrane review observed a reduction in blood pressure of 5.02 over 2.78 millimeters of mercury in hypertensive individuals and 1.08 over 0.24 milligrams of mercury in normotensive individuals. Despite the observed relation between salt intake and blood pressure, the health effects of salt intake continue to be debated. While most studies report a direct progressive association between 24 is that hours urinary salt excretion. I don't know what that means, honestly. It's a bit too sciencey for me, this isn't it? Let's have a look at what that might mean. To be sure, I understand what it means moving forward. Yeah, it does. It means 24-hour. Okay. So going back to that, we'll start. Whilst most studies report a direct progressive association between 24-hour urinary salt excretion and all-cause mortality, others suggest a U or J-shaped relation between morning fasting urinary salt and cardiovascular events. Although inaccurate estimation of salt intake is a potential contributor to the J-shaped findings reported in such cohort studies. Based on modelling data, approximately 3 million deaths and 70 million disability-adjusted life years lost every year have been estimated to be due to excess salt consumption. Considering the strengths and limitations of available data, many scientists have concluded that excess salt consumption is harmful to health, and major health organizations and most governments around the world are actively implementing strategies to reduce population salt consumption. The recent modelling estimates from the Global Burden of Disease data suggest a daily average salt intake in adults of 14 grams, nearly 3 times the World Health Organization's recommended intake of 5 grams. Other studies have estimated lower intakes of 9 to 10 grams a day, which still substantially exceed World Health Organization recommendations. Despite efforts to tackle the high dietary intake of salt across the world, progress on this front remains slow. A variety of salt reduction interventions exist, ranging from structural approaches such as taxation and reformulation to individual focused measures such as health education. Understanding the main sources of dietary salt in a country can help guide the choice of salt reduction strategies that are most effective, equitable, rapid, and cost saving. In particular, the proportion of dietary salt that is obtained from home cooking versus foods made outside the home is an important consideration, as interventions targeted to the more common pattern of salt consumption are likely to be most effective. For instance, reformulation strategies are likely to be more effective in countries where a large proportion of dietary salt comes from packaged foods and food prepared outside the home, whereas salt substitution may be more effective in countries where there is extensive use of discretionary salt. Discretionary salt is salt added to food. Where was it? Oh, right. Discretionary salt is salt added during cooking or at the table. So, uh, at present, there are no reviews quantifying the sources of dietary salt worldwide. Our aim was therefore to conduct a systematic review of the literature to identify the sources of dietary salt in all countries with available data. Our study was conducted under the premise that salt reduction is not only possible but also beneficial. We hypothesized that the majority of dietary salt in high income nations would be obtained from packaged foods and meals eaten outside the home, and in low and middle income countries from salt added during cooking or at the table. Methods. Search strategy. A systematic search of peer reviewed and grey literature published up to 8th of February 2019 was conducted. The systematic review followed the PRISMA, that is PRISMA, guidelines. A protocol for the study has not previously been published. The following databases since their inception were used: Medline, Embase, Scopus, Trophy, Lilacs, Central, Cinal Plus, Global Health, Allied and Complementary Medicine Database, and the World Health Organization International Clinical Trials Registry Platform. Detailed search terms used are provided in the supplemental methods. Click on that, see what comes. And included diet, sodium or salt and source or intake or ingest or consume or survey, and food or cook or product or add or table or discretionary. Only studies published in English and Spanish were included, and no studies published in other languages were identified. Reference lists of eligible studies were scanned to identify additional relevant publications. In parallel, a search using these terms was conducted in Open Grey, World Health Organization, World Action on Salt and Health, and Institute of Medicine databases to identify pertinent grey literature. So before we go any further, I want to have a look at this supplemental methods. What is that? I clicked on it and this is what it brought me to. So I'm assuming, is that right at the bottom of what I've just been reading? Yes, it is. All right. So there's no point in looking at that. It's just something that's further down the page. Okay. Right, inclusion and exclusion criteria. Before I go into reading any further on methods, I want to stop and take a break. It's that hot here. I need to stop and get myself a cup of tea because I've got plenty of water, but it's not cutting it. So let's bang on a tune. We'll have this one.
Exploring consciousness. What does it mean? Looking up definitions, watching narratives fall apart at the seams. From the realm of the dead, stumbling through fractured reality. Truth is a needle in a haystack, wondering what happened to me. Exploring happiness. What does it mean? Looking up definitions, watching narratives fall apart at the seams. Was it all a bad dream? What on earth could have happened to me? Truth is a needle in a haystack. Discern fake from reality. Time lost, pitch black. Dopamine hits, thinking slow and fast. Watching narratives fall apart at the seams. Waking up, waking up. Watching narratives fall apart at the seams. Waking up, waking up, waking up. Waking up, waking up. Exploring consciousness. What does it mean? Looking up definitions, watching narratives fall apart at the seams. From the realm of the dead, stumbling through fractured reality. Truth is a needle in a haystack, Dopamine hits, thinking slow and fast. Watch a narrative fall apart at the seams. Waking up, waking up. Watch a narrative fall apart at the seams. Waking up, waking up, waking up. Waking up, waking up.
We're back. I don't know if I'm waking up or not up with this heat. But anyway, here we are back to give it another go. So, back to the article. Shall I start again? No, we got through search strategies. Okay, so inclusion and exclusion criteria. All studies that provided one, quantitative estimates of discretionary and non discretionary sources of salt, or two, information about the various food groups contributing to dietary salt intake were included. For intervention studies, only baseline data on dietary salt sources were included. Exclusion criteria included studies in pregnant women, those investigating the amount of salt consumed by a population without quantification of the dietary sources, and commentaries on and opinions. Articles were not excluded because of age, sex, study design, sample size, sampling methodology, or geographical location. Titles and abstracts of retrieved articles were evaluated by one investigator in brackets (SB) Sierra Bravo, who was not blinded to authors, institutions, or manuscript journals. If an abstract did not provide adequate information about inclusion and exclusion criteria, the full text was evaluated to determine study eligibility. Sounds pretty extensive, but let's see. Data extraction. Titles and abstracts identified in the initial search of 5,542 were screened, and studies that did not meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria were excluded. It's 5,409. Full texts of the remaining studies, 133, were obtained and screened again based on the inclusion and exclusion criteria. An electronic data extraction form was used to extract relevant data from the remaining included studies, 74 peer-reviewed and 6 grey literature sources. Figure 1, which we will see as we scroll down. Key data extracted included the following: geographical location of the study, years of data collection, method of dietary salt assessment, sample size, average age, percentage of dietary salt obtained from discretionary versus non-discretionary sources, and contribution of different food groups to dietary salt intake. Discretionary salt intake was defined as salt added to food during preparation at home or at the table. Full text screening and data extraction were performed by two investigators, SB and MM. So that's Sierra Bravo and Mike, with any disagreements resolved by discussion to reach consensus. So this is figure 1, is it? Yes. flow diagram for the screening and inclusion of publications in the systematic review that investigated the sources of dietary salt. Is there any way? Open image in new tab that we can look at this more closely. Here it is. Let's see if we can zoom. There we go. 5,542 studies identified, 2,449 were from Medline, 971 were from Global Health, 696 were from Sinal Plus, 661 were from Scopus, 604 from Lilacs, 119 MBase, 41 bibliographies, and one from the World Health Organization. 5,268 studies were excluded. 5,183 titles violated inclusion criteria, and 85 of them were duplicates. 274 studies screened by reviewing abstracts. Of them, 141 studies violated inclusion criteria. So 131 studies reviewed in full. 4 of them were duplicates. 55 studies violated inclusion criteria. 6 grey literature sources identified from bibliographic review, and 80 studies were included in the end out of those 5,542 studies that were identified. Okay, so that was that. Now, the following major food groups were included in our data extraction as they were commonly reported across studies and were major contributors to salt intake: bread and bakery products, beverages, non-alcoholic, cereal and grain products, confectionery, convenience foods, dairy, eggs, meat and meat alternatives, oils and oil emulsions, sauces, dressings, spreads and dips, seafood and seafood products, snack foods, sugars, honey and related products, vegetables, fruits, nuts and legumes, and other. In instances where reported sources of salt overlapped with more than 2 categories listed above, or in instances where discrete categories could not be delineated, the values were reported under the category that likely contributed most to the daily salt intake, based on similar studies available in that country. For example, if a study reported that 30% of daily salt was obtained from bread and bakery products and cereal and grain products combined, and if other studies from that country showed that bread and bakery products contributed to daily salt intake more than cereal and grain products, then this 30% contribution to daily salt intake was reported under the bread and bakery products category. If sodium intake, milligrams per day, was reported, it was converted to salt grams per day by dividing by 1,000 and multiplying by 2.54, the ratio of the molecular weight of sodium chloride, 58.44, to the molecular weight of sodium, 23. Study quality assessment. The quality of each study was assessed by 3 parameters: relevance, representativeness, and risk of bias. Relevance was ascertained by how recently the data were collected, and studies fit into one of four categories: within the past 5 years, between 5 and 10 years ago, between 10 and 15 years ago, and more than 15 years ago. Relevance to the modern context was deemed to be an appropriate index of quality given the rapid nutrition transition occurring in many developing nations that is associated with changes in dietary patterns and therefore sources of dietary salt. The representativeness and hence generalizability of the data in each study was judged to fit into one of five categories: probably representative of the national population, probably representative of a subnational population, probably representative of urban regions, probably representative of rural regions, and probably not representative. In this classification scheme, subnationally representative implies characteristic of a state or region within a country. To determine the risk of bias, we adapted a tool for cross-sectional studies developed by Hoy and colleagues and scored the studies as having low, moderate, or high risk of bias. The tool evaluated each study's methodology by assessing, among other things, sampling technique and internal validity. Studies with scores of 0 to 2 were judged as having a low risk of bias, 3 to 5 as having a moderate risk of bias, and 6 to 7 as having a high risk of bias. Data analysis. Given the large variability in methodologies and the heterogeneity of populations studied within a country, no meta-analysis was performed to obtain pooled estimates across studies. Exploratory linear regression analysis was conducted to assess whether the level of discretionary salt intake is related to the level of economic development between countries, assessed by the annual gross domestic product, that is GDP, per capita. For this analysis, as well as for determining the discretionary salt intake and sources of salt in a country, if multiple estimates from different studies were available for a country, one study was chosen according to the following hierarchy. 1. The study was representative of the national population. 2. The study had the most recent available data. And 3. The study had the lowest risk of bias. For instance, if no nationally representative data were available for a country, then the study with the most recent available data was chosen. The GDP data for each country were obtained from the World Bank website, and there it is there for anyone to click on, for the year of data collection. Data are presented as means plus SDs unless stated otherwise. World maps were created using Excel, Microsoft 2018. All statistical analyses were performed in Prism 6, GraphPad Software Inc. 2015. Results. Study characteristics. The 80 included studies 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, all the way through to 101, were conducted between 1975 and 2018 and represented 34 countries across 6 continents. Now what happens if I click on one of these? No, it doesn't take me. To study. I wonder if I would have to actually be registered with this website for it to click on, like go to something, hyperlink to something that I need to read. Um, anyway. 44 studies, that's 55%, collected data on dietary salt sources within the past 10 years. 33 studies, that's 41%, had data of more than 10 years old. And 3 studies, 4%, did not provide information about when data were collected. Only 32, that's 40% of studies, were judged to be nationally representative, whereas close to half of all studies, it's about 38, which is 48%, were deemed to be non representative of any particular population groups. While most studies were conducted in adults aged over 18 years, that's about that's 40, which is 50%. Some were conducted exclusively in children and adolescents. So that's 12 of the studies, which is 15%, and generally included both males and females, 48 of them, which is about 56%. The sample size ranged from as few as 20 individuals to more than 1 million. The majority of studies had low, 32 or 40%, or moderate, 43, that is 54%, risk of bias, with only 3 studies, 3.8%, having a high risk of bias. Table 1 is a summary of the quality assessment metrics for included studies investigating the sources of dietary salt across the globe. I would say world, not good. So that's what this is. In the last 5 years, nothing collected in Africa, that's an entire continent. 5 in Asia, 3 in Europe, 2 North America, none in Oceania, or whatever, how do you pronounce that? And 1 in South America. Okay, so yeah, 11 in the last 5 years, 33 5 to 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago, 13, more than 15 years ago, 18, 3 missing. In total, we've got 78. Okay. The number of studies in each continent belonging to each quality metric is shown. 2 studies reported data from more than one country and are not included in this table. Discretionary salt intake. 33 studies provided an estimate of discretionary salt intake, supplemental table 3. The average daily salt intake of adults in these studies ranged from 5.2 to 15.5 grams per day. The percentage of discretionary salt intake classified into 3 categories: low, less than 25%, medium, 25 to 50%, and high, more than 50%, is shown in Figure 2. And detailed quantitative estimates are provided in Supplemental Table 3. Populations in Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, Romania, and possibly Benin appear to obtain more than half of their daily salt during cooking or at the table. Populations in Jordan, Portugal, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey appear to receive between 25 and 50% of their daily salt from discretionary sources. On the other hand, discretionary salt intake in Australia, Austria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America accounts for less than 25% of daily salt intake. Okay, so less than 25% is in the West, like, yeah, the English speaking world. So You've got Australia, New Zealand, you've got North America, Canada, you've got the UK there, and that's Finland there. Okay. So South America and India, Asia, consume a lot more salt than is supposedly recommended. Figure 2. Contribution of discretionary sources to dietary salt into the world. Green, less than 25% of dietary salt. Yes, we've gone over that. That's just the key to what we've just looked at. Exploratory analysis of discretionary salt intake as a function of economic development. An inverse correlation was observed between the GDP per capita of a country and the proportion of daily salt intake from discretionary sources, such that for every $10,000 GDP per capita, the proportion of daily salt obtained from discretionary sources was lower by approximately 8.7%. That's 95% CI, 5.1% to 12%. Figure 3, which is this that we're looking at, which is tiny. So, oh no, I've just clicked save image as I didn't want to do that. Open image in new tab. Let's look at this a little more closely if we can. Alright. Because it's getting this too much in detail, because I want to continue reading the rest of the article. So screenshot that if you want to look at that. I should go back to reading. So discretionary salt intake, which is a percentage of total salt intake as a function of per capita GDP. Per capita GDP figures expressed in constant 2010 US dollars were obtained for the year when data were collected for each study. A statistically significant linear regression fit solid line was found. F equals 25.3, P less than 0.0001, with an R2 of 0.55 and slope equal to minus 0.00087, in brackets 95% CI, minus 0.0012, minus 0.00051. The 95% CI of the regression line is depicted by the dashed lines. GDP, gross domestic product. Sources of salt. The proportion of dietary salt from food groups across countries and studies is provided in Supplemental Table 4 and depicted in Supplemental Figure 1. Individual food groups contributing to daily salt intake in countries for which data were available are shown in more detail in Supplemental Figure 2. Some food groups, including bread and bakery products, cereals and grains, meat products and dairy products, were found to be significant salt intake across multiple countries and continents. In many European countries and the USA, the proportion of daily salt from bread or bakery products ranged from 25 to 40%. Cereals and grains contributed up to 24% of daily salt intake, with highest levels noted in China and Brazil. Meat products provided up to 31% of daily salt in the USA. Meat also provided a substantial source of daily salt in some European and South American countries and in Australia and New Zealand, range 4 to 16%. Dairy products accounted for up to 15% of daily salt intake in Argentina and New Zealand, and between 1 and 13% in other countries. A significant proportion of salt, 44%, came from sauces and dressings in Japan, a finding unique within the countries with data available for this analysis. Discussion. In this systematic review, found that countries had data on dietary salt intake patterns, and of these, only 24 had data on discretionary salt intake. The proportion of salt entering the diet from discretionary sources varied substantially between countries and continents. We identified countries where discretionary salt represents a large proportion of overall daily salt intake, including Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, and Romania. Exploratory analysis suggests a strong inverse relation between the proportion of salt obtained from discretionary sources and a country's per capita GDP. While there were no obvious regional patterns in the food sources of dietary salt, bread and bakery products, cereal and grain products, meat products, and dairy products appeared to be the main global contributors to daily salt. Key strengths of the study include its comprehensive search strategy, the large number of studies identified and included, the diversity of countries represented, and the overall low or moderate risk of bias of the included studies. This study builds on the systematic review by Menyanu et al. That reported the contribution of selected food categories to daily salt intake in 7 low and middle income countries. In addition to providing a more up-to-date review on the topic, our study extends the findings of Menyanu et al. By including globally available data encompassing a greater number of countries, quantifying the proportion of dietary salt from discretionary versus non-discretionary sources, identifying individual dietary categories contributing to daily salt intake, and assessing the quality of the available data. Effective population-level salt reduction is likely to require implementation of multifaceted strategies tailored to a local context. Salt reduction policies exist on a spectrum from interventions targeted at individuals, such as diary and education campaigns, to structural approaches such as product reformulation and salt substitution, regulations, taxation. Our results, by providing a comprehensive and up-to-date map of current evidence related to the dietary sources of salt, highlight gaps in the data and may also aid policymakers to direct limited resources toward the predominant dietary salt source in a given setting. Food reformulation policies and efforts have been consistently targeted towards bread, meat, dairy, sauces and dressings, and convenience foods in many countries, an approach supported by our findings. Furthermore, increasing the availability of salt substitutes or reducing their costs is likely to be appropriate in countries where discretionary salt intake is high to facilitate the use of these products in daily cooking. Our finding identified a specific set of countries with a high discretionary salt intake where more widespread use of salt substitutes may be prioritized. Additional research in these countries should also further evaluate the potential of salt substitutes to lower blood pressure. Our exploratory analysis suggested an association between a country's economic development and the discretionary salt intake of its population, possibly capturing the effect of nutrition transition on changing salt consumption behaviors. Most of the urban middle-class population in India, for example, have more access to a variety of convenience foods, including processed, ready-to-eat foods, as they undergo a rapid epidemiologic, demographic, and nutrition transition. Our findings highlight the potential to use a country's per per capita GDP to impute its population's discretionary salt intake, although such an approach will require validation in a larger data set. Several limitations of the study should be noted. Many countries lacked recent studies, and those that collected data more than 10 years ago may have limited relevance to the modern context. This is important given the rapid nutrition transitions, change in lifestyles and dietary trends, and implementation of new and updated food policy initiatives. The majority of the identified studies assess salt consumption among nationally representative samples. While this might be viewed as reducing the generalized of finding at first glance, from a policy and intervention perspective, it might be more important to understand the sources of supply, for example, North versus South India. The results from the preliminary association analysis with the country's GDP should be interpreted cautiously given the potential for ecologic bias. There could be confounding factors such as varying methodologies, for example, dietary recall, lithium labeling, demographic characteristics, and competitiveness of the population studied within between countries. Another limitation of the present study is the substantial variation on how different investigators categorized various foods, making it difficult to directly compare food categories within and between countries. The lack of readily available demographic data for studies and variable representativeness of the population studied, we were unable to perform secondary analyses of salt intakes for subpopulations within each country. Finally, some recent reports have challenged the world view of more major health organizations and governments of the health benefits of salt reduction. Our study does not attempt to address this ongoing controversy. Rather, it was conducted to identify key sources of dietary salt across the world to help guide the design and implementation of salt reduction policies. Our study was based on the premise that population salt reduction interventions are possible and likely to reduce hypertension and cardiovascular disease burden. A number of research recommendations emerge from this review. More studies are needed that incorporate nationally representative populations. Research also aimed to deploy more consistent methods, for instance, related to dietary survey methods and categorization of foods, to provide a more harmonized view of the landscape of salt consumption across the world. While low and middle income countries suffer the highest prevalence, our findings suggest that data related to dietary sources of salt are particularly lacking in these countries, which should be urgently addressed in future. Evidence has identified specific neurons in the control of salt appetite regulation. These findings indicate the need for additional investigations to assess the relative influence of endogenous, is that how you pronounce that? And the external food environment on salt consumption behavior, which will determine the likelihood of success of policies targeting the reduction of salt intake. This is the first systematic review investigating the sources of dietary salt. This study identified countries where more than half of the daily salt intake comes from salt added during cooking or at the table, including Brazil, China, Costa Rica, Guatemala, India, Japan, Mozambique, and Romania. Globally, bread and bakery products, cereal and grain products, meat and dairy products appear to be the main content of daily salt intake. Key food groups that should be targeted for salt reformulation efforts. So at this point, I have to say that, all right, bread and bakery products are grains that have been ground down. okay? But they're basically foods that are whole foods. They come from plants that grow in the ground, you know, the eggs that might go into them, the butter that might go into them, that's animals somewhat from the ground, right? And so that's mentioned in the meat and the dairy product as well. Cereal and grain products, again, they come from the ground. So they should have a natural amount of salt in them. And this then that they represent key food groups that should be targeted for salt reformulation effects. So they're basically whole foods of the natural amount of salt that they should have in them. Those foods weren't supposed to have that amount of food in them, they wouldn't have them in them. And if they have them in them, and those amount of salt is bad for us, which it's only argued, you know, I've not seen any hard evidence to support that claim. It's just a theory thus far. Amount of salt is bad for us, then it should just be that we should. I mean, there's a lot wrong with eating bread and bakery products because we find carbohydrates, right? And they go into our blood a lot quicker for they spike our blood levels, which spikes our insulin resistance. Okay, and that when we're storing what could be nutrition as fat instead of burning it off as energy, right? So yeah, we shouldn't be eating that anyway. Cereals and grain products, yeah, they are high carb. They have the same kind of impact. Meat and dairy products, I know if we're not eating the refined carbs and the grains and cereals, maybe then we're not going to be taking in too much salt so that we can get away with eating the meat and dairy products because the meat, the animals, actually can consume all of those high carb products and take all of the nutrition from them and put that into their flesh and excrete all of the toxins and the sugars and all that comes from those carbohydrates. So I can't help but wonder what are they up to? Represent key food groups that should be targeted for salt reformulation efforts. What's this salt reformulation efforts? What are they going to try to do to meat and dairy products? Right? I've heard about trying to like get meat off the market, try to stop having cows because they fart and all the rest of it, which they've been doing since they first arrived on this planet, right? And it's actually instrumental in plant growth, carbon dioxide. If we didn't have carbon dioxide, there would be alive, right? The more carbon dioxide we have, the greener the planet. That's it. That's been suggested here. Anyway, let's finish this off. It says acknowledgements. The author's responsibilities were as follows. SB and MM conducted the research. SB analyzed the data and had primary responsibility for final content. SB, MM, and JHW drafted the manuscript and provided critical review and feedback for the manuscript, contributed to the research design, and read and approved the final manuscript. And that, my dears, is about as far as I can go for today, and is the end of that article anyway. So the other article that I wanted to go to, I can't. I don't have time for it. But yeah, that was a lot to read. That was a lot to get through, a lot to process. Hello, Graham in the chat. Anyone else who might have turned up? Um, yeah, there's something very, very shady about it. Like, they're doing these studies, and then what they're doing with that information, they're not saying, oh, we should inform about what we've found. It's how do we change populations? How do we manipulate people into changing how much salt they consume, even though it's not conclusive whether salt intake is good or bad for your blood pressure levels. Like, they're still wanting to press ahead with modifying our behaviors, which in Intel circles is known as mind control. Wow. All for salt. Which, by the way, I enjoy copious amounts of Celtic sea salt on a daily basis. Thank you, everyone, here with me, becoming an explorer with me, and until next time, let's listen to this.